Book 3, Chapter 1 of The Cinema Murder. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lucy LaFaro, New South Wales, Australia. The Cinema Murder by E. Phillips Oppenheim. Book 3, Chapter 1. 3 months later, a very different Philip stood in the smaller of a handsome suite of reception rooms in a fashionable Fifth Avenue hotel. He was wearing evening clothes of the most approved cut, and carried himself with the dignity and assurance entirely transforming. The distinction of birth and breeding, little apparent in those half-starved, passionate days of his misery, had come easily to the surface. His shoulders, too, seemed to have broadened, and his face had lost its cadaverous pallor. The apartment in which he stood was plainly but handsomely furnished as a small withdrawing room. On the oak chiffonier stood a silver tray on which were half a dozen frosted cocktails. Through the curtains was apparent a room beyond in which a round table, smothered with flowers, was arranged for supper. In the distance, from the public restaurant, came the sound of softly played music. Philip glanced at the clock. The whole of the anxieties of this momentous evening had passed. Telephone messages had reached him every quarter of an hour. The play was a great success. Elizabeth was coming to him with her producer and a few theatrical friends, flushed with triumph. They were all to meet for the first time that night the man who for the last 3 months had lived as a hermit. Merton Ware, the author of The House of Shams, the new-found dramatist. The maître d'hôtel appeared in the space between the two rooms and bowed. "Everything is quite ready, Mr. Ware," he said, in the friendly yet deferential manner of an American head waiter. "Won't you take a cocktail, sir, while you are waiting?" "Very thoughtful of you, Louis. I think I will," Philip assented, taking a little case from his pocket and lighting a cigarette. The man passed him a glass upon a small salver. "You'll pardon the liberty, I am sure, sir," he continued, dropping his voice a little. "I've just heard that The House of Shams seems to be a huge success, sir. If I might take the liberty of offering my congratulations." Philip smiled genially. "You are the first, Louis," he said. "Thank you very much indeed." "I think you will find the supper everything that could be desired, Mr. Ware," the man went on. "Our head chef, Monsieur Reconnaud, has given it his personal attention. The wine will be slightly iced, as you desired. I shall be outside in the corridor to announce the guests." "Capital, Louis," Ware replied, sipping his cocktail. "It will be another quarter of an hour yet before we see anything of them, I am afraid." The man disappeared and left Philip once more alone. He looked through the walls of the room as though indeed he could see into the packed theatre and could hear the cries of "Author!" which even then were echoing through the house. From the moment when Elizabeth, abandoning her reserve, had given him the love he craved, a new strength seemed to have shone out of the man. Step by step he had thought out subtly and with infinite care every small detail of his life. It was he who had elected to live those 3 months in absolute seclusion. It was he indirectly who had arranged that many more photographs of Douglas Romilly, the English shoe manufacturer, should appear in the newspapers. One moment's horror he had certainly had. He could see the little paragraph now, almost lost in the shoals of more important news. Ghastly discovery in a Derbyshire canal. Yesterday the police recovered the body of a man who had apparently been dead for some weeks, from a canal close to Denton Magna. The body was unrecognizable, but it is believed that the remains are those of Mr. Philip Romilly, the missing art teacher from London, who is alleged to have committed suicide in January last. The thought of that gruesome find scarcely blanched his cheeks. His nerves now were stronger and tenser things. He crushed back those memories with all the strength of his will. Whatever might lie behind, he had struck for the future which he meant to live and enjoy. They were only weaklings who brooded over an unalterable past. It was for the present and the near future that he lived, and both, in that moment, were more alluring than ever before. Even his intellectual powers seemed to have developed in his new-found happiness. The play which he had written, every line of which appeared to gain in vital and literary force towards its conclusion, was only the first of his children. Already other images and ideas were flowing into his brain. The power of creation was triumphantly throwing out its tendrils. He was filled with an amazing and almost inspired confidence. He was ready to start upon fresh work that hour, tomorrow, or when he chose. And before him now was the prospect of stimulating companionship. Elizabeth and he had decided that the time had come for him to take his fate into his hands. He was to be introduced to the magnates of the dramatic profession, to become a clubman in the world's most hospitable city, to mix freely in the circles where he would find himself in constant association with the keenest brains and most brilliant men of letters in the world. He was safe. They had both decided it. He walked to the mirror and looked at himself. The nervous, highly strung, half-starved, neurotic stripling had become the perfectly assured, well-mannered, and well-dressed man of the world. He had studied various details with a peculiar care, suffered a barber to take summary measures with his overlong black hair, had accustomed himself to the use of an eyeglass which hung around his neck by a thin black ribbon. Men might talk of likenesses, men who were close students of their fellows, yet there was no living person who could point to him and say, "You are beyond a shadow of a doubt a man with whom I travelled on the Elletania." The thing was impossible. Louis once more made a noiseless appearance. There was the slightest of frowns upon his face. "A gentleman wishes a word with you before the arrival of your guests, Mr. Ware," he announced. "A journalist?" Philip enquired carelessly. "I do not think so, sir." Even as he spoke, the door was opened and closed again. The man who had entered bowed slightly to Philip. He was tall and clean-shaven, self-assured, and with manner almost significantly reserved. He held a bowler hat in his hand, and glanced towards Louis. He had the air of being somewhat out of place in so fashionable a rendezvous. "Good evening, Mr. Ware," he began. "Could I have just a word with you?" Philip nodded to Louis, who at once left the room. The newcomer drew a little nearer. "My name, sir," he said, "is Dane, Edward Dane." Philip bowed politely. He was just a little annoyed at the intrusion, an annoyance which he failed altogether to conceal. "What do you want with me?" he asked. "I am expecting some friends to supper in about 10 minutes." "10 minutes will perhaps be sufficient for what I have to say," the other promised. "You don't know me, then, Mr. Ware?" "Never saw you before, to the best of my knowledge," Philip replied nonchalantly. "Are you a journalist?" The man laid his hat upon a corner of the table. "I am a detective," he said, "attached to the Cherry Street headquarters. Your last rooms, Mr. Ware, were in my beat." Philip nodded with some slight indication of interest. He faced his ordeal with the courage of a man of steel. "That's so," he remarked indifferently. "Well, Mr. Dane, I have heard a good deal about you American detectives. Pleased to meet you. What can I do for you?" The detective eyed Philip steadfastly. There was just the shadow of something that looked like admiration in his hard grey eyes. "Well, Mr. Ware," he said, "nothing that need disturb your supper,